it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So, in one of my other videos, I did a few videos on capitalism in general, and I invariably, I always get one particular argument. People would say, yes, I can agree with what you're saying, but that's crony capitalism. That's not real capitalism. They're making this mythical distinction between these things. I give that no credence at all. I give it zero credence. And this is my argument for it. This is my argument. So, ultimately, even under ideal conditions, capitalism forces people to work. And it forces them to work based on a lack of their needs being met. Meaning, there are the social natural order of things. Meaning, there are certain things that an individual requires to be whole, to be complete, to be intellectually and physically intact. Now, to the degree that those things are missing, that society will suffer societal ills, crime, poverty, mental degradation, because poverty does affect the mental development of an individual, or the brain development of an individual. It goes throughout the culture. Now, the point I'm making is, if those social needs, and I'm making a point, I'm stressing needs, if those things were to be met, I would make the case that many of the things that you have in this society today would not be propagating in this particular society. Now, ultimately, capitalism exploits those human needs in order to compel people to subordinate themselves into positions that are socially irrelevant. They're socially irrelevant. Even in the best case conditions of capitalism, it forces poverty. It forces poverty. So even if I say, yes, this mythical capitalism exists, and you have ideal conditions, those other things are still true. You're still compelling people to work, not because there's social relevance, but purely because of market value. There's a difference in those things. We don't have scarcity, and yet the model forces scarcity just by the way it operates. And this is the main point, though. That mythical model, I give it no credence because it doesn't necessarily exist. The reality is, people work towards incentive structures. We have a desire for success. Now, I've said before, it's not so much that humanity is corrupt. It's just humanity can be corrupted if it's functioning under a model that gives certain successes, it gives certain credence, or it puts certain emphasis on certain things as opposed to other things. It is a logical response for people to work towards those incentives. They call it an incentive for a reason. By definition, it's something that you want. Now, the reason why I say there's no difference between crony capitalism and this ideal capitalism is because ultimately the incentive structure itself prods people into crony capitalism proper. You can't get away from it. The very act of having one and the very incentives that are built into that particular one prods people into the other. It's almost like a moth and a butterfly. I would make the case that that moth, if it existed, it was a fleeting moth or a fleeting timeline. You invariably are going to fall into cronyism because they're incentivized to fall into cronyism. I mean, understand, it is perfectly logical under the model to maximize profit. That's the point. How can I accrue more and more profit? Now, the model ascribes power, influence, wealth. Those things don't exist in actual reality, so you need to understand. The model itself makes those things exist. It allows people to be subordinate to others, just as a function of the model itself. Now, if your goal was to maximize profit, it is naturally logical for you to reach your hands into the political process. You're looking for ways to A, maintain your profit, to expand your profit. If your goal is to maximize profit, yes, you're going to reach into the political apparatus if you have the opportunity to reach into the political apparatus. And you're going to compel those guys to essentially say, put in policies, regulations, put in things that would adversely affect the public, but increase my market share and increase my influence. That is natural as natural can be. That's no mythical, there's no distinction there. Those things are the same thing. You're talking about something being in one state and naturally transitioning into the other state. It's like beta carotene and vitamin A. Yes, beta carotene is technically different, I guess, if you were trying to come up with this conceptual idea of it. But it would invariably lead to vitamin A. It would invariably lead to that particular vitamin. What I'm getting at is, if you had your idealistic capitalism, it would be a fleeting experience. You would invariably end up with what we have now. You guys are taking this idea of capitalism as some kind of religious thing. It's not religious. It is manifestly apparent in our culture and around the world what capitalism does. And again, I'm making this very specific point in saying the model has incentive structures built in that compels particular behavior. You're acting as if people have this kind of... It takes more energy in this particular model to go against your self-interest. Let me put it that way. Meaning your natural inclination is, how do I maximize my profit? How do I get more? How do I get more? The very act of getting more means somebody's going to have less. We don't have infinite resources. And that's another weirdness with the model. It's completely untethered to reality. It's completely untethered to reality. So, yes, we have enough resources on the planet to give everybody what they need. No, you don't have enough resources in that model because the overwhelming majority of the people on the planet are dead poor. They're completely broke. They're not broke because they need to be broke. Ultimately, their scarcity is driven by that particular model accruing wealth at one very particular end while screwing the rest of the income scale. So yes, I give no distinction between those things at all. And understand the situation in which we find ourselves. I mean, this is not just a conceptual point. This is where we are. This is where we are. So you essentially have a business class that resisted the New Deal. And we said, or for the most part, and let's go back further, the model itself, even in your idealistic model that doesn't exist, you have that society. Let's sandbox it. You have a sandbox, virtual, capitalistic, idealistic, capitalistic society. The people in that particular society start to accrue a particular amount of profit, meaning you're going to have certain people in that society who are, just by virtue of what they're doing, going to do better than others. You can't see that ultimately that to some degree compels a certain amount of poverty just by virtue of not ever having enough jobs to compensate for the number of people who are in that particular society. You may have had it at one point, but as the population increases, yes, you're going to get to the point where there are not enough jobs to compensate. Or there's not enough jobs to compensate for the number of people who are in that particular society. And even beyond that point, many of the things, the goods, the services that are being put out are not done so because they're necessary. They're done so to make somebody a buck. Meaning we have a world of finite resources. And in that world of finite resources, the model incentivizes people to take stuff, turn it into something else, and sell it as fast as possible. Not because it's needed. You're not burning those resources because they're needed. You're burning those resources because you want to put money in your pocket. I mean, you can even go further than that. If you look at each particular individual functioning on their own accord, even in an idealistic capitalistic model, functioning on your own accord completely ignores the rest of society. It completely ignores it. So, yes, I'm going to pull this stuff out the ground and burn it into the sky. I'm sorry you're getting lung illness. Yes, I'm sorry of global warming, but my goal is to maximize my profits. Yes, if I need to come up with some, even fast food, and this is a very interesting point. There is no need for a McDonald's. There is no need for a Burger King. There is no need for a fry cook. Now, the food that these guys are putting out, for the most part, the point is not your nutrition. The point is to maximize their profits, meaning the cheaper the supplies and materials they can use to make that particular food, the less they can pay their workers the more of an advantage they have in that particular marketplace. So that is the incentive for them to do that. Now, the food that they're putting out, again, nothing to do with nutrition. Ultimately, empty calories, high in fat, high in sodium, all this other stuff. Now, because even though this doesn't have a social value, it has a market value for someone. And because of this particular market value, you market to people to get them to buy this empty product. This particular empty product, it's food, it's what you're putting into your system, ultimately kills the individual who's using the product. Now, there's no way for you to say it was the 50th hamburger that caused this guy's cancer. It was the 1000th hamburger that caused this guy's heart disease. But certainly what you eat and what you put into your system aggravates those things. Even if we're talking about the environment, the things that these guys are dumping into the water, the things that these guys are pumping into the air, those are things we are consuming just by virtue of being in our particular environment. Even in an ideal capitalist model, those things will still exist. Work. It's not a fun experience. Now, it may be fun to some people, but ultimately, people are doing these things not because they need to. There's no relevance to it socially. They're doing it just because they don't want to go hungry. They're being compelled to, by the model, to end up in this kind of neo-slavery. Well, ultimately, they're wage slaves. Point A to point B, they get money, they spend it just on the basic necessities of life. And they are compelled to subordinate themselves to some other ruling class just to make ends meet. Even though there is no scarcity. Even though there is no scarcity. The point I continuously make is, get together, determine, make sure our needs are met, and let people pursue their own ends. That is the only way you're going to have any sense of freedom. You can't get that in a capitalistic model, even in an ideal capitalistic model, because ultimately, even in the best situation or best circumstances that don't exist, those circumstances don't exist, but even in the best case circumstance, you're forcing people to work for no reason, and you're forcing the use of resources, and to get rid of those resources for no reason. We have a finite planet, and yet the model says use as much and as fast as you possibly can, even up to the point of planned obsolescence, to say this particular technology needs to die sooner than what it ideally should, if that makes sense. Because understand, if the products that you bought lasted for years on end, ultimately those products will go out of business. The company, that particular business, has a vested interest in making sure that product doesn't last but so long, because ultimately they want to stay in business. None of this stuff has anything to do with society. All of this stuff has everything to do with what these guys can put into their pockets. That's the point I'm getting at. And the employees, under this model, even under ideal situation that doesn't exist, all subordinate themselves to things, essentially turning themselves into slaves, giving up their self-right to determine what they want to do in their particular life. Because if you're working 40 hours in a job, 50 hours, 60 hours that you hate, if you're working 2 jobs that you absolutely hate, and society looks at you and says, for some particular reason, you're not emeritus, you didn't earn what these other guys earn sitting on their ass collecting money on rents or collecting money that's been inherited. No. The issue is apparently you. Even though you're working 80 hours a week, you're not doing anything that's necessary. You're doing something just because you need to put food on the table. That is an amazing thing. That is an amazing thing. I mean, ultimately, you would think that we would say, yeah, work is a pain in the ass. And if I could wake up in the morning and do exactly what I wanted to do, that is an indication of freedom. Working 80 hours, being compelled to work 80 hours under force of not having your needs met, even though there is no such thing as scarcity, and even though that work is completely unnecessary. I have a hard time seeing how that's all that different than slavery. Yes, it's not as vile. Yes, those people believe they have some level of self-determination, but that belief is just a belief. There's no reality to it. They don't realize that they're wage slaves. But even under ideal conditions, they will be wage slaves. And just so that guy can maximize his profits, they will get paid less and less. There is no difference between crony capitalism and regular capitalism. If ultimately you're looking for a way to become free, untethered. You need to get your needs met, which is this understanding that, yes, there will be some socially necessary labor. But there's a vast disparity between socially necessary labor and completely unnecessary labor just for the sake of labor or just for the sake of giving somebody a bunch of profits. That market value labor is not necessary. It's just there so you can give power to somebody else. If our needs were met, if we said we're going to use technology for the betterment of the society, yeah, ultimately you can make yourself free or get as damn close to freedom as you could possibly get. The capitalistic model affords no opportunity for that. Capital is the price of admission. And the wealth, for the most part, allows a certain amount of degrees of freedom. Capital is the point in the capitalistic model. Everything else is subordinate to capital. Meaning that the more capital these guys accrue, the more power, wealth, the more influence they have in that subordinate reality. All that stuff doesn't exist in a higher reality, but it exists within this model itself. Just right off the bat, just by virtue of those guys existing, you would never get freedom under this particular model. It just doesn't allow it. The fact that you're broke, 60% of the population, or 50% of the population, is in poverty, and you have a model that says in order to be free, your degrees of freedom is determined by the amount of capital and resources that you have. Well, if most of the planet is living off of $10 a day, certainly those people aren't free. Certainly those people aren't free. They can't be free in a capitalistic model if you're living off $10 a day. Half of Americans are poor. Now, again, if you don't have capital in a capitalistic model, you cannot be free. Your degrees of freedom are determined by how much wealth you have. If half of the country is poor, if 66% of the population is living off of $10 a day, that very much looks like you have two classes. The 1% and everybody else. Everybody else is getting shafted and everybody else is being compelled to work purely to give those guys more profits. The work that they're doing is not socially necessary. That's the point I'm trying to hit home. It's there purely to give them profits. We could come together as a society and say, let's find ways to automate the processes of our particular society so we don't have to compel ourselves in this particular way. That seems as natural can be to me. If you're saying you want to be free, if you're saying you don't want to be into neo-slavery, you want to wake up in the morning and make a determination on what you want to do, whatever that particular thing is. That model doesn't get you there at all. It doesn't get you anywhere near close to it. The only way it gets you close to that, the only way in the capitalistic model you can get anywhere near close to that, is if you have millions and millions of dollars. You have to have the capital to get that freedom. The majority, the overwhelming majority of the planet does not have that capital in that way. And the model I'm talking about of automating all of the necessary things that we need to exist, poverty, crime, all these things across the entire planet, goes away. The planet makes a determination to improve the planet and improve the living conditions of humanity. You're still going to have socially necessary jobs, that's fine. But there's a difference in doing a job where you have a passion for because it's socially necessary. It's, I want to do this because I need it. And also you can culture the society to go towards particular industries in the same way that the capitalistic model culturally pushes people to behave in particular ways. So let's acknowledge that work is not easy. It's a difficult thing to do. It's a chore. Now, there's some jobs that people just love. You have artists, you have doctors, you have architects, you have certain positions that are both socially necessary and those people love to do. Those people are going to love to do those things. Imagine a situation where in your particular society, you can go to school for whatever you want to go to school for. No cost, no penalty. There's some people who like to teach. Those people are going to be teaching those classes. And hell, even if you need some level of compulsion to get people in particular industries that are socially necessary, that is still vastly different than what we have. That prodding doesn't necessarily need to be against, it doesn't have to be a vulgar compulsion. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be this thing of your needs aren't going to be met if you don't do X, Y, Z. That is completely unnecessary. That is an absolutely vulgar way of trying to incentivize people to work or to move. The goal of life is to pursue it to the ends that you want to pursue it. You can't do that if you're trapped under this illusionary system that makes capital king of everything, and your access to being able to pursue your life in the way that you want to pursue your life is completely dependent upon a figment of everyone's imagination. So, yeah, I don't give it a distinction. Those things are the same. You may want to say one is beta carotene, one is vitamin A. That's fine. But ultimately, as long as you recognize that one invariably turns into the other, just based on the incentives in the model itself, based on incentives, can't get away from it. I'd make the case that that ideal version that these people talk about is a religious belief. It's like their version of heaven. It doesn't exist. It can't exist. Human nature is not corrupt, but it can be corrupted. And if the model is telling those people to function a particular way because they will be awarded for functioning in that particular way, guess what? They're going to function in that particular way. It's not a conceptual leap. It's very clear and apparent when you look at people's behavior versus what the model tells those people to do. Values, human virtues, all those things are great, but all those things takes more energy in the capitalist model, if that makes sense. You have to forcibly not do something that's in your own self-interest in this particular model. That's insane. That's absolutely insane as an incentive. Ultimately, people are going to function on their lowest energy level, meaning they're going to go with the flow. Hey, I can accrue all of this profit. I can accrue all of my whims. I can go any and everywhere I want to go just because of having finances, this illusionary thing. Then yeah, they're going to do what they need to do to get that particular illusionary thing. And they're going to try to persist themselves, or at the very least, improve their circumstance. It just so happens that improving their circumstances adversely affects everybody else. So yeah, I don't like this particular model. I don't think there's a difference between crony capitalism and ideal, mythical, illusionary capitalism. Alright guys, if you enjoy the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe, and you can always support the work through Patreon.